nobody told me the wine business would be so hard. And I was thinking, well, I've got a podcast about why the wine industry is so hard. I should talk to her. So I interviewed her. Lovely, really talented young woman, had created this brand called Margins. And it was she had a tasting room in Santa Cruz. And so we talked about, and she had, what happened to her is what happened in the industry. She had every year she would do a release in the fall, and it would sell through pretty regularly without any effort. Various distributors would take their allocation, no problem. And in the middle of, I think it was 23 maybe, which is really when the trouble really started in earnest. She had her fall release and nobody took any wine. I mean, it was just out of the blue for her. And she worked her way through it, and I published the interview. About 6 months later, she actually reached out to me, and she said, "I'm not going to make it. This is not going to work." And she wanted her parents were, you should sell the wine company, and she knew there wasn't going to be a buyer, but she could tell their parent. I talked to a professional, and she told me because I confirmed. Yeah, it's not that somebody wouldn't buy the wine. It's just that it would be hard for they're hard to find. These are confidential processes. It's really difficult to find a buyer, and unless it's really obviously something that has value in the market. So I confirmed, no, nobody's going to buy your wine company.
Welcome, everybody, back to the Barrels and Roots podcast. I'm your host, Sean Trace, and I have a really awesome guest with me today. Can you tell people who you are and a little bit about what you do?
My name is Carol Collison. I am a M&A advisor in the wine industry. I specialize in working with smaller wine companies, and also 3 years ago started a podcast. So I'm also a podcaster. I have a podcast called Small Fortune, which is based on the old industry joke. What does it take to make a small fortune in the wine business? You start with a large fortune. So
right?
yes, it's really about how hard a business it really is. So
it's super, but it's awesome that you're having those stories. And that's one of the beautiful thing about a podcast is that we can get out there and have those beautiful stories, because if we don't have them, we can't talk about this stuff. I want to ask you this question, though. What first drew you into the wine industry, and what made you decide to stay?
Well, it's pretty much convenience. I live through happenstance, ended up living in Solano County in California, which is the county just east of Napa County. And so I was in banking, initially in small business lending, and started doing consulting with community banks, started working with some community banks in the Napa Valley. And what I discovered about the wine business that was appealing to me is that the folks who are in it are fairly connected internationally. A lot of small businesses in California are that I was working with are based in California, serving California consumers. That's where it begins and ends. But in the wine business, people. If you're a winemaker, like my daughter-in-law, she's a winemaker, and she's worked in Germany, and she's worked in France, and I think she did a stint in Australia. So the business itself, the product itself, just its modern origin is in Europe. So it's more of an international type of clientele, and that just was more appealing to me. And then the other thing from a banking perspective, because now I do sell side advice, but for years I was a lender. And the thing about the wine business is that it is mostly small, closely held companies for which sort of capital markets and other sources of financing are not really relevant or available. So it really is very much a bank financed or retained earnings financed industry. There's not a lot of fancy finance going on. So
Right.
Good from a business perspective.
Yeah. Oh, I wanted to ask you this question because you've worked with winery owners for years. What do the most successful ones have in common?
Yeah, mostly hard work. You do. I think to be successful, you really have to roll your sleeves up. There are, of course, a lot of wealthy people who, are attracted to the industry and see it as their, second, after they retire with all their money, they'll go. You can't set it and forget it. You can't, it just really what doesn't work unless you're in there on the the premises, checking the numbers and, talking to your employees and, rolling. You gotta travel all over the country, to sell your wine, um, and I think that a lot of folks, when they realize how much hard work it is and it's not just a nice little retirement thing, they it doesn't work for them. So, yeah, it's mostly hard work, but, you have to pay attention to sales and profits and, there are a lot again, so the dilettante wealthy people who, you know, have plenty of money to throw into the winery, but as a friend once joked, even billionaires get tired of writing checks eventually, so, you you really do have to work it. It's a tough business.
Super, and it's interesting too because, um, I think people like the prestige, like the glamour, like this, "Oh,
Sure.
yeah, this is my winery, we're gonna go up to my winery." But then they realize it's hard work, man. Like, people have to show up, and you have to, like, get there, and you have to be plugging it, and this is a question I have for you because, like, why do so many people dream of owning a winery, and what do they usually underestimate about it?
Well, I've got I'm sharing, jokes of other people, but, one of the jokes is, people buy a winery when they can't afford a football team, it's it is it can be a game for the wealthy, but, a lot of the very successful ones are, um, somebody who there's two ways that people typically begin a business. One is build a better mousetrap, you have an idea. And the other is you learn the business as an employee somewhere and then you start your own. And there's a little bit of all of that in the wine business. I mean, some people invent some new approach to wine, like canned wine, which started a guy up in Oregon. I think the brand was Underwood. He wouldn't, if he were working for a winery, I don't know his origin story, but he probably would not have had anybody, willing to listen to him about a canned wine product. But, he went out and did it himself and became very successful and created the category that didn't exist before he built the wine company. So, yeah, I think I forgot your initial question.
Like, what when people get into wineries, what do they not what do they not think is gonna be there? And, like, what
Well,
challenges.
I think the sales is the thing that catches many folks who are coming from outside. That's the challenge I think they don't really clock. You can sell your wine to friends and family, a small couple hundreds, no problem, getting that. You can your favorite restaurants and, you can hand sell a couple hundred cases of production. But when you get past that, now you are having to, really hustle to get placements, you're having to deal with distributors, you're having to they call it drag the bag, you're going out in the market with wine samples with, right along with your representative in that market. You're going to retailers, you're going to restaurants. You're hustling, and so, that does not appeal over the long term. I mean, personally, I'm not a big travel nut, right? I'm very happy that my career has enabled me to never have to really travel very much, and so, if you're not into that aspect of it too, if you're not ready to fly to New York for an event or fly to, Ohio or whatever, I mean, that probably catches quite a few people who come from the outside by surprise.
Right? I I was like one of the things that I think that people don't realize about some of those arts, like whether it be food or fine dining, and I remember my friend was a chef in the Napa Valley, and he worked at this one restaurant that had this amazing spinach and artichoke dip. I would spoon a little bit out of it. And she's like, "This is amazing." And one day I was like, "Ah, can we get more of it?" He's like, "Yep." And he says, "That right there is probably one of the most valuable things in here. It's like one of the most hard, like, amount of effort that goes into that." I was like, "Why?" And he's like, imagine a giant truck filled with spinach. Like, that's how much we have to, like, to simmer down for one day. And he's like, and
Mm.
then we have to simmer, then we have the amount of artichoke I have to put in there. And he's like, and we hand make that every single day. And it's gone by the end of the day. And he's like, there's just one little appetizer that we have going with bread. And he says, and people don't understand the amount of work that goes into the little things. And, in
Yes.
any type of food and wine, there is this level of work that goes into stuff that people don't know. And I wanted to ask you this, like, what's one lesson about running a winery that every wine lover should know?
What they may not think about, but what is really key to what makes it such a risky endeavor is that if you're enjoying a nice glass of red wine, um, the vines, you put those things in the ground, it's 4 years before you get a decent crop, but more to the point, even if you're able to just buy the grapes, that bottle of wine, was crushed in where are we? It's '26, so, it was crushed in the 22 or the '23 harvest and processed and aged in barrel and eventually bottled, and usually there's a thing called bottle shock, so you actually, you have to bottle it and let it sit, um, for it most people will say at least 6 months, so, I mean, by the time you're a consumer enjoying a glass of wine, that represents years and years and years of financial investment and work and all the rest of it, so it's, and inventory is sort of the killer, of wine business. You have to really stay on top of it because it is a massive investment, and you can't turn it into cash for a couple of years. So, you have to really make sure and it's hard. I mean, if think about it's difficult enough to forecast demand for next year. Imagine that you're trying to guess how much wine, you're gonna be able to sell 2 or 3 or 4 years later, and that's where, it's not a flexible business. Unlike like, if you're making vodka and there's a sudden increase or decrease in demand, you just run the still 24 you can switch on and off the supply of that kind of spirit. Even beer is made daily. But wine's made over multiple years, and so if there's whether it's an increase in demand or a decrease in demand, there's nothing that they can a winery owner can do in the short term. So, that's I think the inventory cycle is the thing that people I think probably don't think about, but it's very makes it very risky.
I think that people don't realize how hard it is to, like, food and beverage, wine, and different things. Like, one of the interesting things, like, my friend was getting into a restaurant, and he's like, "Well, I have 2 options. One is to have one, like, a few like, 2 or 3 items on the menu and do them really well, or to have a really diverse menu." But he's like, "I wanna have a diverse menu with lots of different foods," and I was like, "Whoa, do understand that you're gonna have to carry a lot of different inventory that's
Right?
not that's gonna go bad." And he's like, "Yeah, but it's my vision, it's my dream." He toned that back pretty aggressively after a short period of time because he's like, "I'm just hemorrhaging money," and
Yeah.
he's like, "I'm spending all this thing and I'm losing money." You know, and it's interesting too because you've talked with people who bought wineries, sold wineries, and even shut down wineries. Which of those decisions is usually the hardest, you know?
Well, I will say, and by the way, restaurants is the hardest business. So, and so, yeah,
Yep.
it's hilarious when somebody in the wine business also gets in the restaurant business, or you can't do
Right.
it as much in California. But I interviewed a guy who had a winery up in. It's a very common business model up in Canada, where you have a winery and a restaurant, and we were just laughing at the preposterousness of having combining the two worst businesses that
Right?
from a risk standpoint. It's just like, why are you anyway? So buying, selling, or winding down. Um, I would say the buying is I peop people, we've been talking about rich people starting wineries. They usually start their own. They wanna put their name on the label, it's very much a vanity project. But from the standpoint of the who's gonna buy a winery, who buys a winery, we kinda track transactions in our firm, and 85% plus or minus of wineries are bought by other wineries. Um, and so for the buyer of wineries, which is again typically, and then a small sliver would be financial buyers, but these are business decisions. So, for an individual manager making the business decision to buy a winery, sure, there's a little bit of risk. Um, but, it's a business decision, so it's not there's not a lot of, drama around this. I'm a cab producer and Pinot's hot, I need a Pinot brand, go buy a Pinot brand. So that's not that complicated. I wish they did it more. I wish we had more buyers, but right now we don't have very many buyers at all because we're in a bit of a mess. But and then selling is, I think, these are my clients. There are people who have decided to sell. And it's almost always because, occasionally, some of the big folks get in with an intention to sell. They build the thing to grow, but that's the exception to the rule. The general rule is that you are somebody who first or second generation in the wine business, and the next generation is just not interested. Um, and so you're selling because, and it's been your life's work, and to send it to, hand it off to somebody is very difficult. So that
For
is a very
sure.
tough decision, and often people, wait until it's too late. Like, that you've got the great Pinot brand, you're loving the experience of owning your Pinot brand. That ship has sailed, right? That ship sailed years ago, shortly after the people will remember, I'm sure, the sideways phenomenon, where very famous a movie where the premise of which was the main character hated Merlot and loved Pinot, and it's funny because consumers are so, I don't know, suggestible, or I mean, it was just a stampede for Pinot at that point. Um, and Merl if you had a Merlot house, you were trying to convert to another varietal pretty quick. Um, at any rate, so it's a tough decision, and there were folks with great Pinot brands that chose not to sell during the Pinot hype period, and they may never be able to, they may not, there aren't as many transactions as people think there are, not as many buyers. So, yeah, you kinda have to strike while the iron is hot, and if you don't, you miss your moment, you're just gonna keep owning it. But it is an emotional decision, so that people do delay until, sort of they might have done better if they sold at the when um, their varietal or their story was appealing. There's plenty of folks who've had wonderful offers that, maybe they thought weren't good enough, and so they held off, and now they're gonna own that thing forever. So, as a seller, to having the discipline to sell when the opportunity arises is, it's tough because, again, these are businesses, but, you may be living on the estate, right? So, to sell your winery, you have to contemplate, like, strangers on your property,
Right.
so, or you have to contemplate moving. So for a seller, it can be a momentous decision, and many just wait till whatever, they go out feet first. So, and then their heirs have to figure out what to do with it. So it is kind of a tough decision, and then it is actually a lot of work. I mean, that's obviously what I do, um, is help people who wanna sell work through preparation for that, because it's just not, it's a buyer, again, getting back to where I started with this, the buyers are typically other wine companies. So they really know their stuff if they're successful enough to be actually acquiring another winery. And so they're gonna be rolling up, they're gonna get into the weeds of your business. And so to prepare for a sale, you have to get into the weeds of your business. And you may be looking at things, I mean, it's surprising that sometimes I find that a winery owner might, for example, not do specific costing. Now, this is accounting and extremely boring, but They may just dump all their costs of production in one big bucket, and or they may make distinctions between reds and whites because those things are processed differently, but they may not get all the way down to the product level, and product by product level. And so, we got to get into that kind of level of detail because the buyer is going to want to know which of these wines are profitable and by how much. So it's a lot of work. So that's another reason. I mean, just the effort to sell is sometimes probably a big hurdle. There's like, oh my God, I know all these sort of, piano tops. There's a famous quote like, if you're in the middle of the ocean in a boat disaster and you find a piano top to hang on to. I think it's Buckminster Fuller. It's fine in the moment but it doesn't mean that, a flotation device should be designed as as a tabletop, it's like, so there are all these things in business that we cut corners and just do whatever because it works. But then, when you get into a transaction, some of these sort of things that you hadn't paid a ton of attention to become something you have to address. So, and that happens actually, that comes up quite a bit as it relates to real estate entitlements. Like, you know, your neighbor's always doesn't care that your well's on his property, but a buyer is gonna not be willing to walk into that situation. So you actually, if you're preparing to sell this thing that was fine for you, like, yeah, my neighbor and I are buddies. He lets me, my well's on his property. It's no big deal. Well, when you go to sell, it's a problem. So you actually have to clean that up before you even go to market. There's all sorts of reasons why. So selling is hard. And then, of course, there's the fact that actually, you can get out to market, and most of the time, in fact, you're not going to find a buyer. So it's a lot of work, and you may end up just having to wind your business down after all. Um, uh, yeah. And then, I just recently in my podcast did an interview with a young woman. I had interviewed her in 24, which was kind of the beginning. Your listeners are pretty up to speed with what's going on in the wine industry, right?
Yeah, very much so.
Okay, yeah, I figured. So they know that we're in the downturn that I characterize as the worst since Prohibition. I mean, it's a very difficult situation we're in right now. Um, and so she was interviewed by the San Francisco Chronicle, and I read the article and reached out to her. And in it, she had said, "Nobody told me the wine business would be so hard." And I was thinking, yeah, well, I've got a podcast about why the wine industry is so hard. I should talk to her. So I interviewed her. Lovely, really talented young woman, had created this brand called Margins. And it was she had a tasting room in Santa Cruz. And so we talked about, and she had, what happened to her is what happened in the industry. She had every year she would do a release in the fall, and it would sell through pretty regularly without any effort. Her various distributors would take their allocation, no problem. And in the middle of, I think it was 23 maybe, which is really when the trouble really started in earnest. She had her fall release and nobody took any wine. I mean, it was just out of the blue for her. And she worked her way through it, and I so published the interview. About 6 months later, she actually reached out to me, and she said, "I'm not gonna make it. This is not gonna work." Um, and she wanted her parents were, "You should sell the wine company," and she knew there wasn't gonna be a buyer, but she could tell their parent. I talked to a professional, and she told me, 'cause I confirmed, yeah, it's not that somebody wouldn't buy the wine, it's just that it would be hard for, they're hard to find. These are confidential processes. It's really difficult to find a buyer, and unless it's really obviously something that has value in the market. So I confirmed, "No, nobody's gonna buy your wine company." And then I didn't hear from her until the Chronicle interviewed her a year just recently, like 3 or 4 months ago, about the fact that she had wound down the company. And so I did a subsequent, interview to talk to her about winding down the company. And it sounds frankly like that's the toughest thing to do. when you hear her story at the sort of the emotion of, that this was gonna be her career, founding her own winery, all the blood, sweat, and tears, all the investment. She owed growers money, she owed banks money, she owed, family money. Um, and so and the lifestyle, right? This is who you are, it's your identity. So I would say of the three, buying, selling, or winding down, it's clear to me that winding the business down is the toughest thing because it won't exist anymore. I mean, I'm working with somebody right now. He's third generation in this business, and it's a very charming little business that I hope I will find a buyer for. Um, and but he wants this, family name on the label to exist in the world. He doesn't wanna be the generation that couldn't make it through. And so we're trying to find a buyer for him. Maybe we will, maybe we won't. But I think that when wine that's the other thing about winding down a wine company is it's sort of, you're giving up in some sense and on something that was so important to you, and in his case, multiple generations. So that I would say of those three ways, parts of a transaction, that's gonna be the hardest to have to give up. But I will say,
It's what Go ahead.
I wanna say that, um, as I said to her in the interview, and goes for any kind of entrepreneurial effort, any kind of business effort, your persistence is required to be an entrepreneur. You have to really be tough because there's many challenges you have to work through, even if everything goes swimmingly. So it's very difficult to hear the information that the market may be telling you that this business isn't gonna go. And so some people, there's an expression in finance that your first loss is your best loss. I don't know if you've heard that, but it expresses the idea that, um, if the signals that you're getting in the market are just clearly this, you're not making any money, your sales aren't growing, if you're really getting signals that this enterprise is not gonna work, the real discipline is to do what's required at that moment, which is to wind the company down, because you can lose a lot more money and end up with the same result. You could still be having to wind it down 2 or 3 years later, but now you've borrowed more money and, you've spent more time, all of that. So it's sort of finding that discipline of saying, "Okay, this isn't working, I have to get out," is really, really tough. So, anyway.
It's a big deal, and I mean, I think that people don't understand all the time. I'm certain that people don't understand all the time the struggle that people have to go to, and I mean, you get into it and no one expects their thing to fail. No one
Right.
starts out like, "Hey, I'm gonna get in and create a business and I am gonna fail hard." But I think that one of the things that is, um when you do enter these time periods where things are tough, you made a good point about like resilience. Like, how do you think what part do you think resilience plays, or is it better to pack it up when things are going bad, or do you try to say, I'm gonna work through this, I don't know. I'm curious.
Yeah, and nobody knows. I mean, I'm self-employed and I've had those gut check periods of time where, I'm not making as much money as I want or need, but I've got years and years devoted to this profession, and, what else I mean, it's tough stuff, it really is, it's hard to know. I just for myself would periodically, when I got to these sort of pain points, try to test my own, um, my own reasons why I'm sticking with it to make sure that I'm not throwing good time and money after bad, that that the there that persisting makes sense. You just have to kind of, you know, uh, find that balance, and it's hard. So,
Yeah, right. Well, I want to ask you, because we've been talking some of the doom and gloom with wine, but do you have hope that things will bounce back or that things will get better?
yeah, well, look, we're getting through a very difficult period. I think the consensus, I mean, somebody broke it down this way, and I think that's probably directionally correct. About a third of the people in the wine business, even today, even with these very significant shifts in demand, basically, is what the problem is, are doing great. They're making money and they're growing. That's about a third. About a third are, back to the idea of persistence. They know they have something good that but they know that the very specific problems are not going to last, and if they're just hanging on to get to the other side where, the demand supply balance, returns, and then they can move forward and grow, and so that's like a third of the business, and a third of the business is not gonna make it to the other side. We are gonna lose many, many, many brands, and some are brands that just really didn't need to exist in the first place. Some are brands that are really fabulous, and it's a shame. Like, I'm not telling this is a public story, but Carlisle, are you familiar with that brand?
No, I
They
did
were
not.
a small brand, highly regarded, top scoring. They specialized in Old Vine Zinfandel and Syrah. But, they were always, like, 95 in The Spectator, just the really well-regarded wine company, no doubt doing well and making money, and I don't know if they tried a sale process or not, but basically, they publicly announced sometime last year, "We're closing up shop." And so even a very famous, very successful winery, is going away, and there's more and more of that happening right now. So about we're gonna be a smaller industry in the US and a smaller in all across the globe. I mean, it's happening everywhere. It's France, it's Australia, it's Chile. I mean, it's a global demand shift, and so it's a global supply adjustment that's having to happen right now. And, but, uh, I it's, business isn't tiddlywinks, it's tough stuff. And we'll get through, and we are. I mean, we're sort of toeing the bottom right now, I think, and things will get better from here. So yeah, and it's a great business to be in, and you know, I don't. I personally would rather do it than selling insurance, but there's plenty of people I'm sure who are passionate about their insurance business. So
Yeah. Well, I wanna ask you this, after all the conversations you've had across the wine industry, what do you think separates wineries from those that disappear?
Uh, I think that the ones that last generally, have, really switched on management that or ownership or management, with the combination of the 2 that just are constantly reviewing the business. They are not, set it and forget it, they're not, um, "Well, this worked last year, so it's gonna work next year." I mean, they're paying attention and adjusting constantly. That, may mean they're adjusting price or switching up products, um, during the pandemic, that was a perfect time when a lot of people didn't make it through because they just didn't wanna having selling wine in the tasting room was what worked for me. I can't do that anymore, and so that's it, I'm out, I just, you have to have that flexibility. The people who succeeded got very, very creative, right? They did, virtual tastings on Zoom where they sent everybody the wine, and then we did the tastings together or, any no when tasting rooms could open, but only, they created, safe spaces for tasting so that people could come but remain, far away from one another. I mean, they found new, wholesale opportunities, where they were, maybe before that, they were strictly direct to consumer, but then they found some wholesale outlets, they hustled. Uh, and, yes, of course, there are these big dramatic challenges that, you really see them, it really separates the men from the boys, but even in a normal period of time, without any dramatic challenges, you still have to be on your game all the time. You have to be watching and, one of the things that seems silly to forget, but profits, I mean, you gotta be watching you got to be sustainable, to make a multi-generational or a very long-lived business, you do actually have to make money. You have to
Yeah. Right.
have built a company. You have to have products at the right price, right? You can't be selling $50 worth of wine for $25 and calling yourself a successful business owner. You have to be selling $50 bottles of wine for $75 if you can, build a brand that allows you to do that. Um, so, keeping an eye on profits, I think, is probably really super important, and making sure you understand profit at the there's a lot of ways to, one of the things that is open discussion in the industry right now is how well you're paying attention to. So most wine companies are direct to consumer, and you're spending a lot of money on tasting room staff, and how people are. People would say, "Oh, look, I'm getting 75% gross margin selling direct to consumer, and I only get 50% if I sell at wholesale, therefore direct to consumer is better." Well, you're throwing a lot of staff and expense to get that 75% gross margin. So, paying attention to, you know, everything you do, you need to gut check. Does this make sense? Is it going to be profitable? Is it going to help grow? You just have to be on all those questions all the time.
Yeah. Uh, Quick question though. If you had to pour a glass right now for yourself, what glass are you pouring?
Oh, yeah. Well, I will say, and I do it all the time, that I am not a wine nerd at all. Um, I know what I like.
That's awesome.
Um, yeah, and I don't even have a particularly sophisticated palate. I will, but having been around it enough, of course. I mean, I'm no slouch. I don't personally, unless it's a dessert wine, I don't like residual sugar in my wine beverage. But to each his own. I'm not looking down my. I heard about a new product I'm absolutely fascinated by. I want to learn more. It's a combination of Coca-Cola and red wine.
What?
It's a thing. Apparently, I know it comes out of Spain. I can't wait to try it.
That's wild.
So anyway, but for me, I would say my general preference at the moment is kind of a GSM, Grenache, Syrah, Mourvedre, kind of a Chateau Neuf du Pape. That was my dad's favorite, was Chateau Neuf du Pape. And in my old age, I seem to have settled into that preference for the those varietals.
That's awesome. Well, where can people go to learn more about you and what you do?
Well, my website is Global Wine Partners. What are we? Yeah, just Google Global Wine Partners. Then you'll find us there, and you can link to the podcast if you want to check into those. And yeah, if you have a winery or you want to buy a winery, for sure, definitely look me up. Especially a buyer. We don't have enough buyers, so yeah, call me. I'll sell you some.